This afternoon, we move beyond Kant's transcendental aesthetic to the transcendental analytic. And if that complicated vocabulary has registered in your consciousness, you'll recognize that that means we're moving from his examination of the preconditions that make possible sense perception to consideration of the preconditions that make possible conceptual understanding and judgments. The transcendental aesthetic is about sense perception, and the transcendental method that he's employing is simply the procedure of bracketing all particulars within the experience, the content of the experience, so as to identify the universal structure of perceptual experience, which is characteristic regardless of all the variables of particular experiences. And you recall that he finds that the two forms of sense perception, space, that is to say we see things in three-dimensional ways, and time, experience comes to us sequentially in time. And the study simply of those pure forms is what gives rise to mathematics. Geometry, the science of space, and arithmetic, the science of numbered sequences, the sequentiality of time. Well, Kant has also told us, you remember, that percepts without universal concepts of some sort are blind. It's not enough for you to say, blue patch now, and I add patch and now to get the space-time qualities of it, the forms. Blue patch now, if that's all you say, somebody will say, what on earth are you trying to say? Because you're not affirming anything of anything. You're not interpreting the blue patch now in any way. So the understanding of our experience, the interpretation of perceptual experience, requires that we call on more abstract general concepts in talking about it. And in the transcendental analytic, he is after those abstract concepts which are the necessary prerequisites for interpretive understanding of what we experience. Just as the forms, structure, perception, so the categories of understanding give structure to our understanding. Okay? And so we want to get at these categories. Now, as we get at them, keep in mind the comparison with Aristotle's categories that I mentioned a couple of days ago. Aristotle identified 10 categories of thought that are also categories of being. Kant identifies 12 categories of thought, but he does not know that they are categories of being. Keep that difference in mind. His categories are really Newtonian categories. So the outcome of this is to conclude that Newtonian science is dealing only with subjective structures of our thinking, the way we structure the world, rather than with the way the world objectively is. In today's parlance, he is not a realist about science, but an anti-realist about science. Science does not tell us about reality. It tells us only about phenomena. And one other thing to notice, that when he does present to us his categories, they come in 4 groups of 3, 4 triads. And some historians have pointed out that this is the beginning of the Hegelian dialectic, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, structuring all thought, and for Hegel, all being. You see? When we get to Hegel, we'll trace out his triads, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, concepts, categories. But Kant's 12 categories come in that triadic form, though he doesn't see it as a dialectic. He doesn't think of that. That comes later with Hegel. Now, the way in which he gets at them, identifies what the categories are, is really very straightforward. If these are the ways in which we understand things, the ways in which we classify things, if you like, the way in which we classify our experiences, then it's natural that if you can lay out a classification of different kinds of judgment we make, that those judgments are likely to embody the a priori categories. And of course that's precisely what he does. So that if you look on pages 388 and 389, and I hope you brought your Kaufman, if not, look at somebody else's. Pages 388, 389, you notice that at the top of 388, he represents under 4 heads 12 different logical kinds of judgments. And as you look over them, you'll think that he's perhaps taken this from an introductory logic textbook, like perhaps you used in Logic 243. Because the quantity of judgments represent 3 kinds that we talk about in ordinary logic, Aristotelian logic. There are universal judgments, particular judgments, singular judgments. Universal judgments, all men are mortal. Particular judgments, some are. Singular judgments, this one, Socrates, is. So these are 3 different quantitative categories. Okay? Then look at quality. Affirmative and negative. Or indefinite. The term infinite doesn't seem quite to fit. Indefinite. Yes or no? Maybe. Affirmative and negative. All A's are B. No A's are B. Affirmative, negative. Okay? The relational judgments we make. In logic, we speak of a categorical judgment. All men are mortal. A hypothetical judgment. If you're a cretin, you're a liar. And a disjunctive judgment. Either you are or you're not. And those of you who've gotten some introduction to logical symbolism recognize that those are the 3 kinds of things that we identify in a symbolic form, so that P and Q is a conjunction of 2 things. You see, P horseshoe Q is the hypothetical, if P then Q, and P wedge Q is the disjunct, either or. You see? So logical form, he's talking about the logical form of judgments. And in the modality, once again, something is problematic, or it's simply asserted, or it's apodictic, that is to say, it's demonstrably necessary. So modality would say it may be, it is, it must be, you see. And we get that even in the moods of verbs in the study of language. It may be subjunctive, maybe optative. It is the indicative, and then it must be thirdly. So each of them has its own form, its own structure, its own logic. You see, each of them embodies some abstract idea, in addition to the particular subject matter of the judgment. Now, what are those abstract ideas, those categories? And you get that at the bottom of 389, where he identifies the categories assumed in the judgments. Categories, again, of quantity, quality, relation, modality. You don't need to memorize the 12, but get those 4 at least straight. Quantity, quality, relation, modality. The idea of a unity, of a plurality, of a totality. Those are abstract ideas. The idea of, under relation, substance and accidents. Yes, the accident that inheres in the substance, the quality, the substance-quality distinction. Cause and effect, and reciprocity, both cause and effect. So the concept of cause and effect, which he told us he was after, comes right there. It's an a priori concept. And then under modality, things like contingency and necessity, possibility and necessity, existence. These are categories that go, in a way, all the way back to Aristotle's thinking, very much embedded in Newtonian and Lockean thinking. And they are things which Hume was quite sceptical about as far as knowledge of them in an empirical or a priori basis. So that's the way in which he gets at them. It's pretty straightforward. Now, before we go further, however, I want you to notice one thing else that he says on 388 and 389. In the second column of 388, towards the bottom of the column, notice this. We'll see hereafter that synthesis in general, the synthesizing, unifying of our thinking, is the result of what I call the faculty of imagination, a blind but indispensable function of the soul, without which we'd have no knowledge whatsoever, but of the existence of which we're scarcely conscious. Imagination necessary for knowledge? Now, look at 389 again, that first big paragraph in the first column. Okay? By means of analysis, different representations are brought under one concept. But how to bring not representations, but the pure synthesis of representations under concepts? This is what transcendental logic, what he's doing now, means to teach. The first that must be given us a priori for the sake of the knowledge of all objects is the manifold of pure intuition, space and time. The second is the synthesis of imagination, again. Now, this is a different concept of imagination than we had in Hobbes and Locke. Their imagination was simply having mental images. Okay? That is to say, the images that stick in your mind, in retention, in memory. The images that you conjure up fictitiously in your mind. Picture images, sense images. That's not what Kant is talking about. He's talking about some imaginative way in which the mind draws everything together into a unified field of understanding that may have nothing corresponding to it out there. You see, we create our own organized world, we imagine it. Now, this is the beginning of the Romanticist conception of imagination. In the Enlightenment, imagination is simply having sense images. Now it's a creative thing, building a world, you see, in the mind. Well, as far as Kant is concerned, there are these universal principles which contribute to this building of the unified world in the mind. These categories. Oh, and then more. But at least these categories. So keep that in mind if you, in mind. I didn't intend that to be a pun. But keep it there anyway, if you would. Now, that's as far as we come then on identifying the categories. Any question there, comment? Yeah.
Okay, you mentioned romantics. And if Kant, how did Kant's conception, how did the romantics say that they weren't universal categories of imagination?
The romanticists are not as interested in categories, particularly logical, rational categories. They're interested in the creative resources of the human mind, of the human spirit. What they add to what Kant does is a reaction against the notion that we're basically rational beings. The notion of the rule of reason, which Kant still holds to, is out there. You see. We are not ruled by what we know, for the Romantics. The Romantics are emphasizing more that we are emotive beings, feelingful beings, imaginative, creative beings. You see. So Kant is the transitional figure, in the sense that, one, he's turning away from the view that we are detached spectators, remember, to the view that we are creators of our world of experience, okay? The Copernican revolution. And two, in bringing that sort of change in the way he uses the term imagination, which becomes crucial in the language of Romanticism. Okay? David? Yes, the forms and categories are both a priori preconditions. That is to say, our sense perception simply works in such a way that we structure all the sense impressions spatially, temporally. Now, when you say space and time in our minds also, well, they're not innate ideas. or self-evident concepts. No. They're simply functional principles. This is the way the mind functions. So it's not that we start with a concept of space or time. It's rather as you start analyzing the actual way in which you perceive things, you begin to realize that you perceive things spatially and temporally. And say to yourself, now wait a minute, I didn't get that from the raw data. My mind must have contributed that way of doing it. The same with the categories, you see. You don't fish through your checklist of categories in your mind and say to yourself, now let's see, do I want a quantity, quality, relational, or modality category in this case? No, you're not even aware of them, you see. But when you look at the understandings that we have and the structures, by looking at the structures, the logical structures of judgments that we make, you realize, no, wait a minute, I don't get those ways of structuring things from experience, you see. I don't experience hypotheticals. The hypothetical is the form of judgment that I get. It's my way of interpreting what's going on. And so you only become aware of these in operation. You're aware of them as functioning. And then you stand back and abstract them from that.
The only 2 forms that we have are space and time.
They are forms of sense perception. Now, if you understand what Kant's doing, you don't need to stop and tell yourself, I must memorize this, only 2 forms of space and time. Those are the only 2. No, you don't have to tell yourself that. Just look at your own sense perception. And you immediately see why he says, only 2. Because there are only 2. You see? He's drawing it from an obvious description of the way we perceive things. Okay? We perceive things in spatial relationships. We perceive things in temporal relationships. Ah, got it. Okay.
As far as the other 12 categories.
Yeah, not the other 12, the 12.
Yeah. I'm trying to find what it was. Okay. Kant believes that these have definite bases or definite uses only when there are those intuitions coming into them and then being separated out.
Yes, these concepts without percepts are empty.
And he says that old-fashioned metaphysics, or the old metaphysics, if it is going to be a science, deals without any of the percepts coming in. Right?
Yeah.
Only with concepts. And he's going to analyze whether you can deal just with concepts.
If it's the metaphysics of the rationalists and their innate knowledge, it's trying to deal with concepts devoid of percepts. If it's the empiricist, dealing only with sense perception, they're trying to deal with percepts without concepts. So when he says concepts without percepts are empty, he's saying to the rationalist, you can't do it. And when he says percepts without concepts are blind, he's saying to the empiricist, you can't do it. Neither kind of metaphysic works. You see? You cannot have empirical knowledge without interpretive concepts. And you cannot have a priori knowledge without empirical input. I'll put it this way. We likened the forms and categories to a lens. Do you see a lens? No. You see through a lens. And you only realize you have the lens and are using the lens when you're without it. You see? So it's not that you're conscious of the lens. It doesn't hang heavily on your nose the way spectacles do. You're just not conscious of it. Okay, does that help? Yeah, so try to avoid saying, you were talking about grouping for the words, try to avoid saying that the forms and categories are innate. In Plato's sense, they're not. In Descartes' sense, they're not. In Leibniz's sense, they're not. You see? Try to avoid saying they're learned, because in the usual sense of learning by experience, they're not. They may be recognized and identified in the course of experience, uncovered, okay? But they're spotted in operation, by function. Yeah. Carl?
The lens is there. How do we know fairly that it is there? The lens is always over that perception. How do we know that?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think the answer is go back to Hume. And without such a lens, like the concept of cause and effect, can you know any matters of fact beyond present experience? No. Your percepts without the concept of cause and effect are blind. You can't know anything, can't see a thing.
So I think it's self-evident that we can't prove this on the lens.
That is self-evident.
That is a priori, but it's
No. No, for the moment, well, let me come back to your first question. Your first question is, how do we know the lens is there if you can't see it? To which the simple answer is, they're not empirical objects. And the more sophisticated answer is, don't you remember what Hume told you? Yes. Hume told you that without the lens of the cause and effect conception, you can't know a thing beyond present experience. Now, what was the second question?
Second case. How do we separate out what is lens?
By the transcendental method. Okay. That is to say, you try and catch it in the act. How do you do that? Well, in the case of sense perception, you bracket out, eliminate all particulars of sense experience, all particular qualities and so forth, and ask what's left. And you find space-time forms. With the understanding, you take a look at the different logical types of